Thanks for the offer to write that introduction. It was a really great process going back to the book, reading it in detail and getting to think about it and its contemporary relevance. And it's a book that, I work as a historian as well. It's been very useful as an activist to prepare for branch meetings. It's also been very useful actually for academic history, just because it is such a comprehensive account of the Communist Party and a critique of the Communist Party. And I think that's what I was, going to say. A few of my remarks tonight is to situate the critique in its political context and then talk a bit about some of the substance of the critique as it's made in the book. One of the things that made the book screamingly relevant, actually, when I sat down to write the introduction, was the fact that the CFMEU was being put into administration, was being attacked mercilessly by a Labor government with the support of the ACTU. This was playing out as I was actually sitting down writing the introduction. Sally McManus was doing, Facebook clips about why the big bad CFMEU needed to be put into administration, why construction workers need to be stripped of their basic democratic rights to actually organise, elect their own, representatives, etc. And it was very striking reading this book at the time because the context in which this is written is the Accord in the early to mid 1980s, when the ACTU was involved in a very ruthless process of suppressing militant unionism and rank and file organisation, and the Communist Party was playing a role actually in aiding that process. And 1985, when it was published, I think it's the same year or just not long before, the BLF was actually deregistered as part of the broader Accord process, or particularly because of the refusal of the Builders Labourers Federation to go along with the Accord. And so, it was very, very relevant, just seeing these dynamics actually playing out in the union movement and trying to understand them. And the title of the book is The Decline of Australian Communism, but the book itself actually provides an entire history of the Communist Party, as the Comrade Chair said at the start, from its formation, its rise, and then its decline. But it's being written at a particular moment. It's being written at a moment when the Communist Party is playing this role, shackling the unions, suppressing rank and file organisation, and it's been written to try to understand that and explain that. And why is this actually taking place? Why is it that the organisation, which is supposedly carrying the mantle of the Bolshevik Revolution, that supposedly stands for working class self-emancipation and the smashing of the capitalist state, is actually involved in this process of ruthlessly, of suppressing unions. And assuming people in this room understand the Accord, but just very briefly, this was a tripartite agreement between the Labor government, the trade union movement, and business leaders in Australia to say that trade unions would stop going on strike and would wind up rank and file led militant action in exchange for centrally fixed wages, which was supposed to increase, and in exchange for what was called the social wage, the idea that there would be public spending and government investment, to actually provide for the working class, not through disruptive industrial action, but through an agreement that the working class should in fact get a particular piece of the pie. And the Communist Party was able to play a role in implementing this policy because it had real roots in the working class, and particularly real roots in the militant sections of the working class. And so they were able, to speak with credibility on the shop floor in industries right across the country about why, comrades, we've actually got to stop going on strike, and why we've actually got to accept this rationale. And so, as I said, the book is very much about trying to explain and understand how it is that the party came to play that role. Like the impact for us of the Accord, like my generation, I was born in 1982, so I don't remember any of that politically, but have grown up politically, if you like, in the wreckage of the Accord. And that is the catastrophic collapse of union organisation in Australia. So when the Accord is first brought in the early 1980s, union density is just tipping below 50% of the Australian workforce. It's now at 12%. Right? Tom quotes from figures that were actually put to a Communist Party conference, but put there uncritically, about the extent to which the profit wage share had already started to tip far more decisively towards profits. And I give the figures, I won't read them out now, but there's some figures in the introduction about, again, you've seen a massive decline in the share of GDP that's actually going to workers as opposed to going to the capitalist class. That's been another feature of the Accord. And it's Tom's Marxism and his revolutionary Marxism and his understanding that the way workers make change and make gains in a capitalist society is through self-organisation and self-activity. It's that insight which allows him to understand that winding up militant organisation in the workplace is going to be catastrophic for the actual social position of workers. Whereas the Communist Party, as he argues at the time, who had a socialism from above perspective, who for many, many years had originally, and we'll go into some of this in this talk, had embraced Stalinism, but, by the early 1980s thought that they could be clever, and, these union leaders, including Carmichael, who I think was the deputy leader of the ACTU at the time, who was president of the Communist Party, big figure in the Metal Workers Union, we can be sitting around the table and representing workers' interests, not actually understanding that workers have got to represent their own interests and got to organise in their own interests. And by shackling the working class's capacity to actually organise for itself, you're going to go backwards. And that's what we have a duty to actually try to turn around, to actually rebuild our unions. And in that regard, I think it is a very polemical book. And it's polemical precisely because the stakes were so high at the time. And part of those stakes involved the fact that the Communist Party actually had the cream of Australia's working class in its ranks for many, many years. And while the book is fiercely critical of the Communist Party's overall political outlook, it is also, acknowledges, and it's very, very important that we acknowledge, and the book actually is dedicated at the start to the thousands of Communist Party members who day in, day out went out and actually stood up for justice and fought the system and organised in their workplaces and looked after people at work and made sure that union meetings were called and organised and followed through on, and people won wage increases and they were safe at work and took on racism and took on war. It was a mass organisation of radical working class people. So that's the stakes. That's why the book is so polemical in terms of its critique, is it takes so seriously the question of how can you have an organisation that's so important for the Australian working class, that's full of Australian working class militants, that can actually end up playing this social role in terms of selling the Accord. And I just want to give just one example I thought from some of my own research about the importance of the role the Communist Party did play as being a mass organisation of workers, of militant workers. And that's just some of the research I've been doing about the role of the Communist Party and the trade unions in the Aboriginal rights struggle. And I gave a talk yesterday, some comrades I think tuned in, thanks very much for that. But there's one example, one little story I told yesterday, I'll tell today, and that's the experience of Aboriginal Communist and Builders Labourers Federation member Ray Peckham, right, who came to Sydney from Dubbo, joined up with the BLF, got involved in the communist movement, got involved in the union movement, and thought, oh my God, here is the power that can actually take on the system. These unions are organised, they can fight, they can win things. They can win things for my people. This is the way we're actually going to organise to make change. And the Communist Party provided a network of militants across workplaces which made it possible to actually appeal to and lean on and utilise a working class organisation precisely to exercise power and go about starting to try to make some change. So, there's just one example of one of the many struggles was a rent strike that was organised on the Purfleet Reserve, which is shocking conditions. Aboriginal people segregated just north of Newcastle there on a reserve that, the manager had intense control over who could come on and off the reserve. People have got no sanitation. People are in shocking conditions. There was many children died of diphtheria in about a 12-month period. And one of the leaders there, Horry Saunders, he'd actually worked as a builder's labourer in Taree, just up the road, on a government building program, building houses for poor whites, and he'd met communists and he started to get involved in the movement, and he thought, hey, they can build houses for poor whites, they can build houses for us, we need to take a stand. And he called a rent strike on the Purfleet Reserve. The government tried to evict him from the Purfleet Reserve. The Communist Party used its union networks to actually mobilise in defence of Horace Saunders, eventually defeated the government's attempts to try to evict him in the Supreme Court, but they didn't rely on the court, they relied on working class organisations. So Ray and Horry went on a tour all around unionised sites, all around unionised building sites in Sydney, all around, the coal mines, all around the power industry. And I'll just read, this is just in a 2-week period. This is Ray campaigning, going to various meetings. He addressed 50 workers at the Illawarra Coke Works in Coalcliff, 120 day shift men at morning meeting at the Coalcliff Pit, the South Coast Board of Management of the Miners Federation, the Illawarra Trades and Labour Council, 60 men at B&W Steel Ferry Meadow, 130 striking miners at Necco Colliery, the Port Kembla Sanitary Depot where there were more than 50 workers, the Port Kembla Waterside Workers Stop Work Meeting, the Tullawarra Power Station Stop Work Meeting, 200 miners at Wongawilli Pit, Little's building job, the University of Wollongong building job, the Berrima Cement Works with 180 workers, the Berrima Coal Mine, 80 men in the Berrima Coal Mine, and many more not reported. That's in a 2-week period. That's utilising Communist Party union networks to actually be able to go out and take a message to the working class that says there's a fight on for Aboriginal rights, you should stand with the Aboriginal people. And it's that sort of pressure that started to break up the power of the Aboriginal welfare, of the Aboriginal Welfare Board. So that's what's at stake here. You've got an organisation that's capable of doing that. What actually happens and why does it go on to play this role? Because I think it's very important to understand and recover the history of what has been done as a class in Australia and this organisation, this kind of organisation, and the role of the Communist Party in the process, but also the fact that there's also a truth that the Communist Party's politics weren't actually able to navigate the twists and turns to actually deepen and radicalise that struggle in a way that could seriously confront the system. So at the end of the 1960s, when they invade Czechoslovakia, the party's in crisis. Ray goes into crisis, right? I've sat with the man and talked to him about this whole process. He thought they're building socialism in Russia. All of a sudden they're sending tanks into Czechoslovakia. What the fuck is going on? And there's all these rows in the meetings about what do we say about Czechoslovakia. There's a split that comes in the Communist Party. There's a struggle to actually deal with the rise of the sort of black power militancy. How do we deal with this? At first it's like, no, this is a distraction from joint unite and white fight. And then when they win out, and win out in the movement, suddenly they're tailing the movement and just uncritically following everything the black radicals are doing, because there wasn't a consistent sort of political anchor, because of what had happened in terms of the degeneration of an actual Marxist analysis within the Communist Party itself. And at the core of this book is, it doesn't give you those histories of all of those different campaigns that the Communist Party does. You have to go elsewhere for that, and that's important. But what it does do is give you a real framework for understanding why the party took positions at particular times, how that was related to the international situation, and how that was related to the particular pressures that were existing on the party leadership. And I was just going to, I think, just with the probably move to close, but just the last point that I'll make is I think there's one of the things that's really important. There's two actual points that sort of dovetail that are really important in the book, and that's about understanding the bureaucratic attitude to trade unionism that actually develops within the party is a function of two things. Firstly, it's a function of Stalinisation. So from the late 1920s, communist parties worldwide, start to have to follow, if they want to be loyal to communism, the dictates that are emanating from Moscow, that because of Stalin's counter-revolution are no longer grounded in what is the best for the international working class movement. They're grounded in the question of what is the best thing for the Stalinist bureaucracy, right? And it's quite masterful in the book, the way that Tom shows the twists and turns of the different positions that are coming from Moscow, where suddenly we're against the Western imperialist powers full on. You've got to fight with everything you've got, with the third period in the early 1930s, and all of the Labour Party that are supporting the government are all actually social fascists, and we've got to mercilessly attack the Labour Party and the leaders. And then when Stalin says, actually no, we need an alliance with British and French imperialism in the mid-30s because we want to have a popular front against Hitler, suddenly it's like, oh, okay, it's a popular front, right? And the Communist parties now have to embrace like nationalism. And in Australia, they actually start to embrace Australian nationalism and fly the Australian flag at May Day, and moderate a lot of what their of their criticisms of Australian imperialism in the region and a range of things. So, and I think ultimately what Stalinism says is it's not the self-activity of the working class that makes change, it's that the working class is somehow embodied in and represented by the bureaucracy itself that controls the state. So the only way you can say it's a worker state or a socialist state is if the bureaucracy actually represents the working class. So that rubs off into the leaders are infallible, let's protect the leaders, it's important the leaders represent the class in some way. So there's a bureaucratisation and a fetishisation of bureaucracy that develops there. The other thing that's happening simultaneously in the Australian context is the Communist Party, who'd grown dramatically in the 30s and then even more dramatically through the Second World War, which they participate in full on, like as part of the Popular Front sort of period, actually start to develop bureaucratic sensibilities leading these big unions with all the pressures that actually exist on trade union bureaucrats to in many ways actually accommodate themselves to the system. So these sorts of things actually start to act together and start to profoundly influence the actual way that Communist Party, organises in unions, the way that it organises itself, and there's particularly undemocratic, I guess, practice that starts to develop, and it's not about actually encouraging radical rank and file democracy within unions. It's about following the line. Now that's not absolute, right? And as I said, there's plenty of great militants who join the Communist Party who do take initiative and do fight for radical democracy. And there's the whole experience of the Builders Labourers Federation and what they were able to do in terms of democratising their union. So it's not absolute, and those sorts of nuances are explored in the book. But yeah, that's what I think is the real strength of the book, is the way that it actually gives you a framework and the tools and a very thoroughly researched account of those twists and turns in the development of Stalinism, in the development of international politics, how they actually impact back on the Australian situation, and why this leads to, the party playing a particular role in the radicalisation of the 1960s and 70s, but then can sort of go on to play this particular role in terms of actually implementing the Accord and jumping in holus bolus with the idea that we actually have to, in some ways, protect Australian capitalism. We can manage Australian capitalism in the interests of workers and just embrace reformism. So anyway, I might leave my comments there. It's all getting a little bit convoluted, but it's nice and clear and thorough in the book. So I encourage you to buy it and read it, and yeah, plenty to talk about. Thanks, comrades.